many times. Nice castle,
Yes,
nice cathedral.
yes, yep.
Um,
Got the
and,
Magna Carta there, and yep. Excellent, excellent. Well, I really first off just wanted to say thank you very much for taking the time to have a chat with me. I was super excited uh, when I saw your piece on the I think it was Sage Journals. I'm not sure if that's
Mhm.
so when I saw that, I was already sort of wanting to have a chat with you, Keith. But seeing that and being that flow, I'm not sure if you know. I would assume that you don't know much about what I've been doing, but it's a big part of my martial arts journey, and it was actually something that when I got in touch with Ian Ian Renshaw, I actually brought it up in that first sort of email. I said, you know, have you made any connections there? And he said, oh, it makes sense. So yeah, I'm really keen to have this discussion. So I suppose best thing to do would be start out with some introductions. How about we start with that?
yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Excellent.
So do you want me to start?
That'd be great. Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah. Okay. So Sam, I'm Keith Davids. I'm a professor of motor learning. I work at Sheffield Hallam University, which is in the centre of the UK, but towards the north of England. And I've been working in motor learning and skill acquisition for a few decades now, a bit too long. And I'm interested in understanding, developing a theoretical framework based on scientific principles of how people learn and what the learning process is, because I think that's something that we can improve upon. And this has practical consequences as well, because I very much believe in improving the learning experiences for people when they're being taught, when they're being coached, when they're just learning by themselves as well, you know, so that they get the most enjoyable experience, but the most effective learning as well. So that's me.
Excellent. David?
All right, I'm David Farrokh, and I'm a PhD student at Sheffield Hallam, studying with Keith, also Joe Stone, James Rumbold, Ben Strafford. But my thesis is titled Ecological Dynamics, Perspective on Flow in Sport. So it's kind of bringing together some, the work that Keith and the rest of the group have done around skill acquisition and ecological dynamics, and then kind of seeing how that might afford us new perspectives on this concept of flow that we'll, I'm sure, dive much deeper into as we go on.
Yeah, excellent. So I suppose for a lot of the people that will follow my channel, they'll already sort of understand my excitement around it and sort of what my understanding of it is so far. I do have a little bit of a history. So I mentioned in that email about Stephen Kotler, and he wrote a book called The Rise of the Superman, and it was essentially flow states in extreme sports. So that was very interesting to me, but it was actually the reason why it sort of caught my eye was a friend of mine about more than a decade ago now, when we trained together and we used to go to and from training, and we'd be talking about flow states and that sort of thing, because he did his, I believe it was some sort of a maybe a dissertation or something at university in 2001 relating to flow states in martial arts. And so the information up until 2001, a lot of chicks sent me high and those areas. but it sort of stopped there. And the Stephen Kotler, he wrote that book, but also had an institute, I believe, in America. That's why one of the reasons why I sort of mentioned him. But I'm sure that you've got probably a significant amount more information out there from numerous other sources. So if you can define for us what would flow states be, a little bit of history where it is, and how it relates, and how you started to relate it to ecological dynamics and the constraints-led approach.
Yeah, if I start, before David gets into the defining flow states from an ecological approach, I've been interested in it for a while. I think because I once experienced it in my. I'm a footballer. I played or soccer, as you might call it in Oz, and I once had this experience which I wasn't aware about. I played a whole game, and it was just like I was in slow motion, and I was in a sort of dream. Everything was flowing. Everything that the way I interacted with the environment was almost idealistically perfect. And it's only ever happened once, and it was a nothing game really. We won it quite easily, but it wasn't like some sort of a final or whatever. But I've never ever experienced anything like that before or since. And so I became interested in it, and especially when I read about flow states back in the 1990s, I think it was. But I was interested in it. I became interested in it as an academic from more of an ecological explanation. That is, trying to find an explanation where you didn't have to delve deeply inside the individual for all the kind of mechanisms, the causal context, etc. And so the last few years I've been trying to put that together, and then David came along a few years ago and took up a PhD program in that area. It probably wasn't what you had in mind when you first arrived at SHU, David, but you really have taken the challenge on board and really enhanced your expertise in the area. So perhaps now you want to talk about what it might, what it was before our ecological intervention, as it were, and what it might look like now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'll just very briefly try to situate a little bit the history of flow. As you mentioned, the name that's kind of associated with the concept is typically a Hungarian psychologist called Mihály Csikszentmihalyi. So he was born in Croatia, actually, in the 30s. So he experienced, a lot of World War II and was displaced as a result of that, lost family in the war, and was very much interested, coming through those experiences to understand what were the meaningful experiences that kind of underpinned well-functioning societies. So he had really kind of grand aims to understand a lot of these things deeply, and as they related to very personal experiences. So he went to study psychology, and this time when he went to study was in the late 50s. It was very much kind of a behaviorist landscape. So a lot of studies of like rats and mazes, and kind of a bit dull and dry, he felt. So he wanted to be able to actually return to those kind of experiences that he thought were very meaningful, that in his perspective at that time, he felt like psychology had kind of lost touch with those things. And at that time, there was something called the cognitive revolution was happening, sort of this return to the internal states. And he kind of went he went all the way in on that. And he kind of said, well, flow is something that's internal. And the way he kind of came to develop the theory, I should also say, was he wanted to say, okay, well, if people have this sort of internal agency, they're not just sort of being pushed and pulled around by external forces, there must be some way that we can understand these activities that people do for no other reason, right? So, if we all go to work, we kind of understand that we do that, to to take home a paycheck. But if we were to go and play football, presumably nobody's paying us. It's difficult to locate those kind of traditional rewards. So he was interested in finding why people did those kind of activities, right? So where there isn't an obvious reason outside of the activity itself. So he kind of started by looking at what are the characteristics of the activities that people do for that type of reason, where there doesn't seem to be a lot of traditional rewards like fame or money or things like that. So out of that, he started interviewing people who had participated in those types of activities. And that's where we get the 9-dimension model. So that's kind of one of the most commonly known frameworks for thinking about flow, which is, he said, well, there's probably about 3 preconditions that kind of set the stage. And those being that you need to have some kind of a balance of challenges and skills. You need to have some clear goals, so there has to be a bit of structure to what you're doing. And you need some type of unambiguous feedback to be able to assess on the fly, like what's happening. And then the descriptive characteristics that kind of are the way people explain how these experiences felt, where they said that it's a deep concentration on the task at hand. So that's one of the kind of the fundamental things. Is all your attentional focus is on that activity. It's not particularly scattered. You have a sense of control where you feel like you're able to affect the outcome. There's a transformation of time, like Keith mentioned, which is interesting because it can be both the slow motion and it can also be the sense where you may have done an activity for 2 hours, but it felt like it went by very quickly. And a loss of self-consciousness. We tend not to be particularly reflective about ourselves in those states. And when we have those kind of characteristics, it also tends to be something that we return to in this way. There is sort of autotelic, or meaning it's a goal into itself. So that's kind of just briefly the background of where this concept kind of originates. And it was something, like Keith mentioned, that I experienced playing football or soccer, and was very meaningful to me. It was something that drew me to the game. And also, like you mentioned, I read Kotler's books, and that was, he does a good job, I think, presenting it to a broad audience in a way that it makes it exciting and interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think your description there, David, was really compelling, because it sort of brought to mind why I felt that flow, conceptualizing flow, really needed to be brought towards the ecological dynamics approach, because this notion of being one with the environment, of a system flowing within a larger system, being able to go off in different directions, and information, the notion about information guiding the system, but contributing to action as well. So you have this sort of information action coupling, as it were, which is quite smooth, and it's really kind of difficult to pocket them into discrete components acting. I get information, and then I act, and then I experience, and that sort of thing. It just seemed to fit with this ecological dynamics emphasis on information flows guiding the system, but also as the system flows, it provides information to then regulate its actions ongoingly, at one with the environment. A lot of times you hear those ideas and they can sound a little bit sort of fluffy, but from a dynamical systems perspective, it all aligns with the conceptual framework. So I felt like, we had something to offer on that side of things, because as you mentioned, David, it was kind of locked up at the time, and I think there's an important message there, Sam, in terms of when people take a look at a theory, a scientific theory, to explain a phenomenon like learning, learning movements, acquiring skills, how to practice. It's important to understand that that theory is relates to a particular time, and has an historical basis. There are cultural, historical, social factors that are really kind of aligned with the theory. So it's not, these things aren't timeless, and there are explanations for why maybe there was a reaction to a particular theory which reduced all human behavior to a stimulus response relationship, and people thinking, well, I don't just respond to the appearance of a stimulus. There's more to information than that. And then people saying, well, maybe, and this happens in psychology a lot. In history of psychology, people have used the latest technology as a kind of a concept, a framework, a metaphor for understanding human behaviors. And at the cognitive revolution, as David called it, at that time, computers were beginning to be really implemented into life at a really large scale. And so that's what happened in psychology. A lot of concepts and ways of thinking became framed within the latest metaphor. And I think from there, then there's a natural logical flow, as it were, towards seeing the human environment relationship nowadays as a more important way of understanding human behaviors.
Yeah, definitely. One thing that I sort of took from a lot of from those 8 or 9 characteristics is that it's a very intrinsic thing. It's all internal, and one of the things that sort of really got me excited was the first few times I implemented CLA in a grappling environment, in a martial arts grappling environment. I found myself in flow so quickly, and the way I sort of looked at it, having sort of made the connection kind of afterwards, but this being at the forefront of my mind, it was about the challenge. So and there's also a challenge, and there's also a risk involved, which kind of forces you to focus. And when you're focusing on something, particularly in a grappling environment where maybe the thing is that you're trying to choke someone, and you're trying to stop that, there's a challenge, but there's also a risk there. So yeah, you kind of have to be in the moment, and the moment you're out of the moment, you're out of flow, and you're potentially in trouble. And I found when I was in flow, using CLA, and I bit of history, I've done numerous other traditional martial arts, taekwondo, kung fu's, all sorts, and I'd always been searching for what the traditional thing would be, the mind of no mind, so doing things in flow, essentially. Moving meditation was how it was kind of sold to me in my early looking for Mr. Miyagi days, and I've done years of those and never really found it, and then sort of 3 months into grappling, I was getting these moments, and they would be I would pull off a move where I didn't think about it, and I would be on top and go, wow, that's amazing, and I'd have that moment of, hey, I did something without thinking about it, and I feel great, and it's almost like a bit of a meme through the BJJ community, where you go to training, and when you finish training, you've got nothing in your head. You can go in with all the troubles in the world, and by the time you leave, there's zero troubles, because I believe that that's because we enter flow so quickly and so often, and usually in the old we call it the IP methods, that would happen at the end of class when we do free rolling, where we can do whatever we want, and go from there. Whereas with CLA, we're already there. As soon as I start the class, we are doing a game that has a singular or 2 or 3 win conditions that they both have risk, they both have challenge, and they both have reward. So I'm really keen to find out sort of where you guys are at with that kind of viewpoint, the extrinsic versus the intrinsic. If that has any bearing whatsoever. I am, as I said, a lay coach, so I've got an understanding of the underlying stuff, but you guys are the experts. So I suppose, Keith, what were some of those things that you noticed that the observations of ecological dynamics with flow states that sort of triggered you to look into it?
Yeah, actually, that's fascinating. I talked to so many practitioners and learn so much all the time. And your discussion there of your, you use a constraints-led approach, and that gets you, quite quickly into flow states. And that's quite interesting. You see, that observation has been chased for a long time, because what you're talking about there, the automaticity, this notion of automaticity, I don't have to think through, I don't have to actually regulate sequentially every step of my action. I become one with the environment, if we use sort of lay language, and it's not demanding on my attention. I can pick up information, I can regulate my action, I can achieve my intentions, the goals and aims that I'm after in performance. Traditionally, automaticity has been chased down the route of, well, if you repeat this technique, this movement, as many times as you can, and if you, for example, practice for 10,000 hours, that was one version of it, then you can perform that movement in an automatic way. You don't have to think about it, and it can be almost like robotic, and you could be in a trance-like state where there's no cognitive demand to you, and you can perform really well. That's one way of approaching it, but that comes with a big demand. It's very challenging for some people. I can't begin to say how much I think that can put off people practicing, this repetition, rehearsal, memorization of movements, etc. Over-coaching, coaches intervening too quickly, imposing their view, their model, their template on the learner. But another way of becoming one with the environment is being engrossed in it and in the flow, and getting to that sort of, if you like, that sort of perception action coupling state of organization, where your movements create information, that information then regulates your actions, and you've got this sort of flow, as it were, in this performance landscape, and behaviors emerge. So David, perhaps you can take us through the history of the intrinsic and extrinsic characteristics that have, if you like, that have been used in the conceptualization of flow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the first thing I would say is there's a saying, it's slipping my mind who said it, but a problem well posed is a problem half solved, right? And what sort of occurred to me and Keith as we were developing this the research plan was that flow somehow was a perfect storm where it brought together a lot of the issues that had been kind of noted over various periods of time in cognitive psychology, and it kind of brought them all into one place, where it's almost the worst case scenario for a lot of those framings. So one of those being sort of the extrinsic intrinsic dichotomy. It still contains certain assumptions about things being localized. So something is either inside of me and it's just generated from sort of an internal component, or it's only outside in the environment, and then I become merely a passive response to that. So kind of building on what Keith said about sort of this reciprocity of action and perception, we move to perceive. So, that's an active component where that is something that we're doing, with agency in the world. But we also are perceiving affordances that constrain our action. And because those are so mutually interdependent, throughout the whole process, it becomes very difficult to say, well, this action was only generated from an internal perspective, and this one was only sort of pulled from the outside. Because really there's very much like you see in martial arts between, two practitioners, there's always sort of this kind of a give and take. So I think some of the ways that we've started to look at intention a bit differently through the work of people like Alicia Guerrero, they've started to kind of break down some of those boundaries a little bit to give us different ways of thinking about some of these circular and kind of extended processes.
Yeah. All right, cool. Yeah, I think one of the... So I've been implementing CLA in my classes for probably about a little over 6 months now, and I found that within that time I've plugged more holes in my game than I have in the past 10 years. And I think it just resonated so quickly with me. You said it before, Keith, where someone's trying to put their concept in your head, and the amount of times where people would be talking about their concept of this technique, and it just wouldn't make sense to me. And it was like, well, you're talking about how you interact with your environment. I mean, that we are in the same environment, but that's your perception of your environment, and it doesn't work for me. And so the perception action coupling just resonated really, really quickly with me. So how did you get so Keith, you mentioned that David came from a different angle. What was your original angle on flow states that got you to then? Where was that meeting of minds for flow states and CLA?
Yeah, because it was kind of like fenced off in psychology. It was researched and presented as part of like positivistic psychology, in terms of the human experience and how humans can experience a wonderful euphoria almost with their at extreme level, with their interactions with the environment. And the explanation was internalized, as David said. It was kind of, I ignored it to start with. It was like you noted it and you go, yeah, that's interesting and that's quite relevant. And I didn't really see the sort of relevance to ecological dynamics until I thought about it a bit more. And I wasn't aware about the... David, as the PhD student, delved deeper than I did into the literature, and he came across the sort of a little bit of dissonance in the literature base for flow states, where people were a little bit concerned about some of the sort of the internal focus, as it were. In psychology, there is a criticism of some psychological approaches. The term organismic asymmetry is used, organismic asymmetry. And all that means is that there's this bias towards thinking that psychology is really only to do with above the neck, what goes on in the brain, in the mind, thinking here. This is where thinking goes on. And the rest of it, this is just a physical apparatus that carries out the commands or whatever that goes on here. And an organismic asymmetry is really about a bias towards internal explanations. So, for example, the idea that to become skillful, to become really comfortable in a performance environment and face the challenges, enjoy the challenges, then you need to adopt automaticity, and that automaticity is seen from an intrinsic viewpoint. You can actually see that in a different way, as I said, and so it was only when I started thinking about an ecological approach where I thought that actually some of the things that James Gibson offers, some of the insights, the founder of ecological psychology, James Gibson, who said that really we should stop looking at, for explanations internally. We should start looking for explanations in terms of the individual environment relationship. That's the proper scale of analysis, not the individual, not the environment only, because in psychology you have this internal bias, you also have this environmental bias. It's that point of interaction or relationship between the two of them. Just to go back to your point there, Sam, for example, Gibson distinguished, he said there's different types of knowledge. So when you talked about a coach trying to impose, I have this template technique of a movement in my mind, and I, really learning is about you matching that, fitting that. And if you don't fit it, that's error. That's not adaptation. That's not part of skill learning. That's error that I've got to delete. And Gibson talked about different types of knowledge. So I think coaching and teaching in the past has relied too much on what Gibson called knowledge about the environment. So somebody describing the environment, so you're getting secondhand information about your movements, your interactions with the environment, in terms of knowledge about it. So there may be pictures. Here's a picture of this hold. I want you to try and replicate that, or explaining, giving verbal information about how to perform an action. That is really about a person's relationship with the environment. What Gibson said is actually what we should be doing is spending more time focusing on knowledge of the environment. And knowledge of the environment is gained through interactions. So as you move, you create information. That information then helps you to regulate further actions. And that is all founded on knowledge of the environment. So when the implication is, this insight, when we design practice tasks, then it should be based on knowledge of the environment, which is really founded on an individual finding their way, interacting with information sources, objects, events, obstacles, obviously the person in front of you, etc., and their movements. And that has big implications for what the athlete experiences and also how we teach the athlete.
Self-organisation is something. I mean, I am about halfway through this one.
Yeah.
I've read the Constraints-Led Approach and Rob Gray's book. I'm sure you probably that was a good introduction. So one thing that I noticed as well is that a lot of what's being researched, I suppose, and I think you'll agree with me on this, is that a lot of it has been self-reporting. So and I think this can kind of dovetail into another question would be, how have they measured flow states in the past? It is on top of self-reporting, and how are they able to do it now, and how do you foresee it in the future being able to be measured, particularly as it relates to CLA, ED, and flow states?
Do you want me to take that one, Keith?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Sure. That's a really good question. It's a lot of what we've been kind of diving into in the PhD. So there's been sort of two branches, a bit of flow research. I think it's fair to say it is a little bit kind of bifurcated in that way, where you have a largely sort of qualitative, descriptive branch of flow research that will, say, speak to an athlete or somebody who's been in a flow activity and kind of get these descriptions, a lot of them quite rich. And that is a lot of what we know about flow comes from that source. The other kind of side of that is sort of the physiological, which, as kind of Keith mentioned with the organismic asymmetry, it tends to be quite neurocentric. So looking for sort of like markers of, well, if somebody is in a flow state, might there be some corresponding physiological marker that we can identify, so that when we have some technology that enables us to track that marker, we could then say, are they in a flow state or not? So kind of building on what Keith said about the organismic asymmetry, the issue with both of those is that they are both internal. So if you think about in all of these flow experiences, so martial arts, action adventure sports, surgeons were another one that Jake sent me high studied early on, right? The thing that ties a lot of these activities together is that the outcome of the activity is determined by the way that you relate very precisely to the environment. So if you're in, some type of, say, martial arts contest, it's quite distinct. Like either you get submitted, or either the person's fist hits you in the face or it doesn't, right? So that's what your immediate concerns are when you're in these type of activities, right? So whether you're able, say, to slip a jab or whether you're not able to slip a jab, that's directly meaningful to somebody who's, say, in a boxing match. And we should expect then that a lot of people's experiences correspond to really these affordances. So just going back to Gibson's original work, affordances were these opportunities. And interestingly, they can be for good or ill. So, you might have an affordance of slipping a jab, but also, if you're not able to get away, then, there's an affordance of being struck, right? So we would expect that performers in flow are very much concerned with what are the affordances available or unavailable to them, and that should quite closely link to their experience. The problem is whether you have descriptive self-report or a physiological marker of certain brain states, neither of those track the flow or this kind of fluctuations of affordances in a dynamic task very well. So that's a lot of what we're trying to look at. There's a concept called eco-physical variables that's been introduced by Eduardo Araujo, Keith, and others in the group as well. That's sort of a measure that has sort of an interesting status where it's not an internal marker and it's not a purely external marker. So it's jumping across some of those divides, and it's kind of looking at the way that the performer is adapting to the performance environment. So what we're thinking is, in terms of measuring flow, we should look at things that are relevant to the performer's ability to adapt, right? So to kind of to make this kind of maybe a little bit clearer, an example, let's say you've got someone who's doing quite risky activity, like they're free climbing, right, on some type of a rock wall. There's quite clear consequences. If you're unable to grip the wall, right, you may fall. So if you imagine those situations, it starts to become pretty clear from the third person external perspective. If you see somebody's grip beginning to fail, it's not really a mystery what their experience would be, right? The sense of panic would be directly proportional to the affordance of being able to grip the wall, right? So we think that this concept of eco-physical variables might give us a better foothold, pun intended, into these experiences and flow states, as opposed to just looking at neural or physiological markers or self-report. Of course, those can be still very useful in terms of looking at different factors that could be constraining or influencing the experience. But we think that it's this direct performance environment relationship that's probably where we should spend most of our time looking for ways to measure flow.
So that's interesting, because one of the things that really struck me when I started entering flow more regularly with CLA was that because I wasn't thinking in a linear progression through techniques anymore, I was flowing through techniques, but then I would get to a point where I wouldn't know, or like I'd know what to do, but I would come out of flow and be like, oh, here's somewhere where I'm stuck, and there would be I'd sort of take a mental snapshot and say, I've got to put myself back in this position numerous more times, and the best thing is being the instructor I can, and I have been able to do that over several weeks. But that was something that I noticed that I could do kind of almost immediately, going in and out of flow. And I think there was something that I read, I'm not sure which paper, but I think it might have been you, David. So flow is best understood as a discrete or continuous phenomenon. Is that?
Yeah, it's a big question in the research.
Yeah, and whether it's like, are you going in and out of flow, or is it just you're sort of peaking and troughing, that kind of thing? I'm super interested in that side of things as well. So how do you think? I mean, I've gone through some theoretical measurement ideas, and particularly being that the environment that the grappling and martial arts are in, you don't need to track someone up on a free climbing wall. You don't need to track someone on a soccer field, for example. It's all in this one small environment that you could kind of, I don't know, put some markers on it. Is there blood sort of takes that you could have, or anything like that you'd look into?
Yeah, you've actually got markerless motion systems now, camera systems that's sophisticated enough to track coordination patterns. So if you wanted to look at movement characteristics as part of these eco-physical variables that David talked about, you don't have to look inside the brain, what's going on in the brain or the central nervous system, and then correlate it with some sort of subjective report of an experience. You can look at movement patterns as an athlete engages with the environment. To go back to your point there, if we can see flow as part of ecological dynamics, and so the athlete is a dynamical movement system the parts interact with each other, and then this movement system is part of a greater system, the environment, a deeply intricate part of it. Sometimes dynamical movement systems, their flow, their stability is perturbed. So there may be some perturbations through the movement of the system, and that can disrupt the functionality of the movement system. By that I mean it can disrupt the stability if the system wants a bit of stability, but it doesn't. Sometimes it can be disrupting to be too stable, and there is a region in between stability and instability, which is called metastability. Now, metastability basically is a dynamic form of stability. So it's where, as a mover, you have enough stability to achieve your goal, but you're not stuck there, suddenly going, what do I do next? You can flow, and there are different ways to flow to in the performance landscape. Practicing in the metastable region is a really good way. It's somewhere that we should look at in terms of future research, understanding future research on flow. In other words, how can individuals harness we've all got self-organization processes that we can exploit. They're intrinsic to our body. That essentially means that we can adapt and adjust as the environment changes. It may not be perfect to start with, but we can, with practice, we can become better at harnessing self-organization processes. And really then for me, coaching is about creating learning environments where the athlete addresses, by that I mean they orient their body, their posture, they regulate their interactions with an environment, not in a stiff, rigid way, repeat this technique, but show me how you adapt to this as this is changing, as I perturb this according to the skills and ability, the experience of the athlete, as I perturb it, show me how you adapt. And that for me is the way that flow could go forward. I don't know what your thoughts are there, David.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really good points. And that's actually a lot of what we're looking at, slightly different contexts, 1-versus-1 interactions in a futsal context. But we're looking at that metastable region. So in sort of my very limited understanding of jiu-jitsu, bits I've seen and rolled a couple times years ago, but you kind of have these transitions, right, where you kind of begin, and you get in all the martial arts, there's fluctuations, right? The performers are kind of dancing at that edge, and then at some point there's sort of a commitment, right? And there might be a quick series of reversals, something, and then it could kind of lock into a more stable state. Someone establishes a hold, right? Is that it's somewhat accurate for?
Yep. So there'd be someone in the space talks about immobilizing a limb to then to then gain access to the center mass, immobilize the center mass to then isolate and attack a limb or a thing. So yes, definitely.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So within these sort of transitions, there's certain points where the future is most undecided and it's most co-determined. So what I mean by that is each performer is trying to get into the region of the space. It might not just be a physical location, because it also has to do with momentum and things like that, but where you're able to respond advantageously to any movement of the opposition, right? So that's the sort of this optimal place to be, is where, well, if you do this, I can counter with this. If you do that, I can counter with this. And that's a lot of what the metastable region seems to be, is both performers kind of self-organizing, where I'm doing something based on what you're doing something based on what I'm doing, but collectively, sort of as a dyad or a pair, we're moving towards some kind of an edge or this boundary, right? Mm-hmm. And that boundary is the point where it's going to very kind of rapidly reorganize. But the performers who seem to be able to hover close to those edges, those metastable regions, they seem to be able to gain an advantage when that phase transition, that reorganization happens. So it might be in a grappling sport, like literally a full reversal, or maybe somebody's able to release from a hold and resituate the whole coupling the dyad. Yeah. But intuitively, we think that there's a link there with flow, because those seem to be moments that were very deeply engaged in the task, or it would be the moment that you have the highest demand to kind of be very aware of what's going on.
Mm. Yeah, awesome. Yeah. So what are you currently working with to sort of identify these measurements? I suppose would be a good segue.
Yeah, I think just as a sort of a bit of a summary point before David talks about his PhD program, these 1v1 dyads, they're a kind of a natural performance context in sport, in many sports, from team games to martial arts, clearly, boxing, for example, jiu-jitsu. We think they're good context to take a look at flow from the point of eco-physical variables, looking at self-organization processes, how they're harnessed, exploited by individuals, and emergence, what we call emergence. So in other words, where behaviors emerged. Now, sometimes when you talk to martial art athletes, you can see where the movements aren't pre-planned. Now, I mean, I'm not saying that this is every boxer, because actually too much coaching in the in 1v1 dyads across all sports is too much about, you know, if this happens, then do this, if that happens, too much pre-planning, rather than going with the flow of how the system evolves and then trying to get an advantage in the system as information emerges, and exploit that information to regulate your action. I was during the week I was at a national boxing organization, and with a master's student, and we were looking at trying to get some access to the organization for a PhD program of work. I was absolutely impressed by the coaches were very open-minded to this notion. We showed them a video clip of there's a boxer, Emmanuel Augustus. I don't know if you're you know, how up to speed you are on boxing, Sam. Emmanuel Augustus is known as the Drunken Master. Drunken Master.
I do know him. Yep.
I thought you would have done. Yeah, I thought you would have done. I could not get out my mind how his movements. He operates in the metastable region. You know, the region of dynamic stability. He is in flow. He's using a lot of dancing, flowing movements. He actually, you mentioned before about risk reward. He puts his body, so in boxing and a lot of these dyadic sports, the interpersonal distance between, you know, I don't know, attacker, defender, or two people involved in dyad, that's a really critical variable. It's quite important. And Emmanuel Augustus, he puts himself in a very uncertain context in dyads. This is what boxers don't do. Normally, if they're going close, you know, they're like this, and they're very rigid and upright and protecting themselves. He goes in, and he'll stick his face in, the guards are low. And we said to the coaches, they knew it, of course, they knew this video clip, they've seen it before. They said, do you think this is showboating, or is this you know, constructive movements where, you know, in the dyad, he's trying to get an advantage of dyad? And they said, yeah, up to a large extent, this is functional. These are functional behaviors that he carries out. A lot of it seemed to be excessive, you know, a few dance moves thrown in.
I saw he got a bit in trouble with the ref a couple of times as well.
Yeah. I think it's misinterpreted. I think actually there may be a level beyond which it is showboating. But you know, some of the greatest in the history of boxing used to showboat, and I don't even need to mention his name.
You've said the greatest. You've said it.
Exactly. So, you know, there may be above that, and the coaches said, yeah, above that is a bit excessive, but they could see how it was, you know, related to flow, and it was related. In fact, what, you know, unsolicited, the coaches talked about flow. They were saying, oh, his movements, he's exploiting flow there, and that sort of thing. So I think 1v1 dyads is a great context for it, for exploring these eco-physical variables. So I don't know if you want to add anything from a research perspective, David, on that.
Yeah, I think, so Keith mentioned earlier about organismic asymmetry, and one of the things about these dyads, which are common contexts for flow, is you sort of have this question, it's like, well, which of us is the organism and which is the environment, right? Because each is to the other, right? So
I'm so glad you said that just quickly.
Yeah, from either perspective, you can't really determine fully what's happening. So another way you could say it is, well, are you acting or reacting? And it again becomes quite meaningless, because you are acting, you know, you are doing things, but you're doing something because of what the opponent's doing, and they're doing something because of you. So that was the point where we thought, okay, well, if both of those individual subcomponents, so the individual performers, are an inadequate scale of analysis, then maybe we need to go up, or to be able to look across multiple scales. So kind of thinking, and it seems a bit odd because it's like, well, we're playing against each other, but to actually say, well, what are we doing as a collective dyad? If you almost imagine that as being a super organism, you say, well, what is it, the dyad, doing? Right. So that's where we have some of these collective variables. Keith mentioned like interpersonal distance. Let's say if you're boxing, right, the range, right, the edge of the four-inch boundary to be struck, that's going to be a very key interpersonal distance. You'll see the performers very much edging that region. In what we're looking at, there's one called the interpersonal angle. So, if kind of the attacker's kind of gone past the defender towards the goal zone, they're more likely to kind of have already destabilized. If the defender is able to kind of stay between the attacker and the goal, right, they're stabilizing the system. So looking at the angle between, that's kind of a higher level characterization of the dyad. So those are some of the things that we're starting to look at in terms of ecophysical markers for flow, but also interestingly kind of linking very closely the experience of the performers.
Yeah. So you notice there that the variables we're looking at don't correspond to the movements of one of the participants. It would be the dyad as a whole. That's the system, and the system components are interacting. They're highly interconnected. So really, it's quite a intricate understanding to understand. What are the variables where you can measure the behavior of the system together. It's not about isolating components and studying them separately. That would correspond to another theoretical framework. An ecological dynamics approach pretty much looks at the system as a whole and tries to study the behavior of the system. And that's why ecophysical variables are quite important to isolate, i.e. to kind of identify them and then to measure them in different performance contexts. Because I'd imagine that interpersonal distance would be an important component of the jiu-jitsu dyad, but there'll be other variables there that may not relate to football dyads or basketball dyads or that sort of thing. So
yeah, I mean distance is definitely a huge part. Getting frames in, keeping people away. If you're on the bottom, you don't want people to be squashing you down, so you want to be making space. When you're on top, you want to be squashing them down. So yeah, that makes sense. Sorry, David. Okay.
And this, and this is something that I'm quite interested in studying. How athletes through coaching and practice are facilitated in addressing the environment. And addressing the environment in different sports is going to differ. But unfortunately, if you focus on repetition only, so if you say to a coach, what's important in practice? What do you think are really it's important to get right in practice? Invariably, a coach will say, repetition. You need repetition. To become skillful, you need repetition. But I think we need a nuanced understanding of the term repetition. And Nikolai Bernstein, he's a Russian physiologist who really influenced movement science in a big way. He pushed the field towards studying coordination rather than control, top-down control, as a means of explaining skilled behavior. Bernstein argued that we should be focusing on repetition without repetition. Repetition without repetition. By that, he meant that what we don't repeat is a technical movement pattern in isolation and memorize that, rehearse that, choreograph that. We repeat the solving of a movement problem. The solving of a movement problem. So, for example, when you're on top, as you mentioned, squashing down, what's the movement problem for your opponent and for yourself? And how do they solve that problem? When you're underneath, of course, then the movement problem is different. How do you solve that problem? So solving the movement problem is really, it's going to tax a coach tax a coach in terms of challenge them to set up practice designs that allow people to explore, find different ways. And I think that could be linked to flow, where they have to be deeply engaged rather than just repetitive rehearsal, constant, maybe, they're addressing the environment in a single posture, but being put into different contexts, which challenges them to find different ways to solve the movement problem. That means that they need to have the skills, the capacity to address the environment, the performance environment, in different ways. And by that I mean interact with it, change their posture, change their body orientation, and sometimes use what are called non-conventional, unconventional ways of acting, of interacting. And it's not to show, it's to actually challenge the opponent, create problems for the opponent to solve, but also for you to solve problems, become a good problem solver yourself.
Okay, yeah. So, it's. I suppose it would be hard for you to give me an example that I could take to the mat on that. Is that referring at all to differential learning, or is that how much stock do you put in the idea of differential learning?
Yeah, differential learning is focused on discovery learning, and discovery learning is a valuable method of learning. The problem with discovery learning is that it takes a long time. It takes a long time, and patience. The coach has to have a lot of patience. Athletes have to have a lot of patience. If you haven't got that time, essentially in discovery learning, you challenge an athlete to, here's the environment, find a way. It can be a bit more nuanced than that. Guided discovery is where ecological dynamics sits, and the role of the coach is really important here. This is where the coach really can show their skills. You give too much guidance, traditional practice can be saying, I want you to replicate this. I want you to rehearse this. This is the way you solve this problem. If this happens, you do this. And that's too much guidance, because, when you're on the mat, your opponent poses a problem for you. You can't look to the coach and go, tell me what I do now. Some coaches would love to mic you up so they can instruct you about, lift your elbow 10 degrees or whatever, all this sort of stuff. But that's not going to happen. So really it's about giving enough guidance for the individual to explore and discover a solution, but it's within one part of the landscape. So they're not exploring all over the place. The constraints-led approach really is the skill there is manipulating the task constraints, creating them so that an athlete is exploring a part of the performance environment, not this part over here, which might be really relevant, further on down the line, or, it may have been relevant before when you were learning fundamental skills, but, we focused on this particular. So this is why a problem-based approach is quite good, because that can help you to guide the discovery, help the athlete to understand where to explore, where to search. Doesn't mean that the coach is passive. Doesn't mean the coach is standing there reading a newspaper, having a cup of tea or whatever, while the athlete's going on. The coach has to use the skills, verbal instructions, visual models, information, really to help the athlete to discover knowledge of the environment. So it's the knowledge gained through interactions. And those interactions could be like this, very broad, or could be very narrow. It needs to be set at the right level for an athlete at a particular part of their journey.
Yeah. I mean, I found since I've been using the constraints-led approach, when I first started, I was doing 2-3 hours of sort of research the night before, and thinking about it and trying to figure out. I'm a bit more efficient. The system degeneracy sort of has come in, and I've become a bit more efficient with the coaching side of things. But I am so engaged, so much more so, and exactly what you said. It's looking at a portion of the game, and the game's massive. The game is so massive, but if we can take a portion of the game, it means that You don't have to worry about all the other stuff that could happen, which allows you to focus, which then gets you into the zone or into flow states, and that, from what I understand, also facilitates learning at a much higher pace as well. I imagine that's got something to do with the endorphin releases, hormones, etc. Is there anything in relation to that, David, that you're looking at with regards to flow states, or anything else with your PhD, with your program that you're looking into?
Yeah. So as far as like hormones, that we don't have any plans at the moment to look at any of those physiological markers. It's not to say there couldn't be utility in looking at those. I think we've just been kind of looking, like Keith said, at this kind of the problem-solving aspect, kind of centering that. So looking at, experience as a function of this fluid problem-solving process that will have these kind of peaks and troughs, like you said, within it, where, maybe you feel like you're going for a certain hold and you're almost going to get it, it's slipping away, right? And you can kind of see how that's going to start to create these fluctuations in experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I'm just wondering. I mean, how do you measure that then? Because that feels like a very internal thing. That as in measuring behaviour from that perspective, are you measuring pauses? Are you? Yeah, tell me about that.
Yeah. So without getting super technical, we're basically looking at how different scales of action relate. So you have sort of these nesting relationships where, let's say at one point, maybe you're standing facing the opponent, and then you kind of you get into a certain hold. And then you could think about things that happen from that point as being nested or kind of situated within that larger scale situation.
Okay.
Right? So what we're looking at is the way that actions kind of nest across different scales. And if you think about, just to kind of try to clarify a little bit, if you were just completely moving randomly, and there was no purpose behind your action at all, it wouldn't have any relation to itself over time.
Yeah.
So when we look at behavior that has intentionality to it, it's not random, right? It's constrained, and it's a process of self-constraint, right? Where you're sort of, because you have certain objectives, you are kind of allowing your past behavior to constrain your future behavior. Right. So once I've, say, committed to, a certain stance, a certain position, a certain hold, right? And this will vary depending on the activity. But then the actions that happen after that point are kind of sitting within that previous decision.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
You funneled yourself to a specific area that then has its own affordances.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. So we're basically looking at how those temporal nesting relationships might be able to predict performers kind of being in those metastable regions.
So are we monitoring? Sorry, we like I'm on board with you. But are you monitoring sort of limb position, that sort of thing? Like pause, as I said before, pauses. Are we using machine learning, like AI, anything like that?
Yeah, really good questions. So we're using motion tracking. We're tracking sort of the center of mass. Ball task.
Sorry, David. Just paused for a second there. So back to the.
I'll just rewind a second.
Yeah.
I was just saying we're using motion capture to kind of track the sacrum or the lower back, more or less the center of mass of each of the players. In this, the task is designed to put them in this kind of a metastable region where they're both responding to each other for the duration of the activity.
Awesome.
So we're kind of looking at those fluctuations of this kind of central marker, which it kind of determines then, the affordances to an extent based on where your center of mass is, right? Because just based on body morphology, roughly, right, it gives us an index that we can look at some of these fluctuations.
And as you say,
then,
with the angle of the person towards the goal.
Right, those kind of things.
Sweet.
And
I think that captures what I mean by the importance of addressing the environment, the competitive environment. So for different sports, the performance environment, the context, even within the performance environment, changes. And so athletes becoming good movers and being able to adapt and change the way they address the performance environment is a crucial part of lots of sports. And, I think in the 1v1 context, that is quite important. Just to go back to, there was a really interesting discussion about the nature of variability, and David brought in the idea of random variability. And some coaches may be under the impression that if you had that you need to add variability to the practice environment to help the individual explore and adapt, and that is true. Adding random variability has been shown to work, but it facilitates the move towards discovery learning, which is you need to have a lot of patience. It's going to take a lot of time, and if you're working with a learner and they got like 2 1-hour training sessions per week, it's going to take months, years, decades in order to exploit that random variability. Constrained variability is much more relevant and important. That is essentially the variability that focuses the individuals involved in a 1v1 dyad to adapt or constrain their actions so that they come up with the relevant performance solutions. And that's why repetition without repetition in practice. With a coach working with the athlete, co-determined, as I think that David used that phrase before, it's whilst the relationship between an attacker and a defender is maybe co-determined, the relationship between a coach and an athlete can be co-adapted as well, to come up with the relevant sort of solutions and relevant training designs for their problem-solving activity.
Okay, fantastic. And do you how many coaches do you work with then? I imagine there's a number and across a variety of different things. So, how many coaches do you currently work with, and have you worked with?
Well, David's a coach, for example. A lot of, at the moment, the ecological dynamics approach, we're so the work's going on at lots of different timescales. There's always the theoretical development. So this is a great example. This is why I like this PhD program. Great example, because we're looking at the concept of flow, which has always been, as I said, captured in one particular explanatory framework, and we're looking at that. So adding to theory, contributing to theoretical understanding, offering alternatives, undertaking scientific research, working on getting data, results, information. So it's evidence-based. And that could be qualitative, getting insights, perceptions and opinions and views and all that, but quantitative as well, the measures that David talked about. It's quite important that we're in this phase now where we're working to apply the ideas. We're not just sticking in an ivory tower and our work being published in journals. I mean, this is why these podcasts are so invaluable, because they challenge us to explain these ideas to get out of our comfort zone, explain these ideas in more applied ways, to talk to coaches, resonate with coaches, learn from them in what they're doing. So to go back to your specific question, when it comes to, we have lots of conversations with coaches in different sports, and invariably we're not the expert in the room. Even in sports like, I mentioned before, I have a background in football, and I feel probably at my most comfortable in that, talking to football coaches, etc. But they're still the experts in the room, obviously, because football's changing all the time. But really, our approach is to provide principles of practice based on theoretical ideas and evidence as well to coaches. And then really the discussion is with the coach, and this is what we're hoping that listeners will take away from this podcast is, okay, how can I change my practice? Do I want to change my practice based on what I've heard? Does it have any implications for me? And clearly, Sam, what was really heartening was to hear you talking about the way that you immediately resonated with principles of the constraints-led approach, and that is quite rare. I'm not saying that it never happens, but it is quite rare that somebody straight away thinks, "Oh, this is."
I'll put one minor caveat to that. It did take me. I got introduced to it. As in, we should look at games, and I was like, I don't know. And then someone sent me a link to someone, and my coach. So I've got a coach. He sent me a link, and I was struggling a little bit with where I was in my journey, so I thought, well, look, something's got to change. I'm training 5-6 days a week, and I feel like I'm stagnating. Let's have a look at an alternative approach, and just everything. As soon as I started looking into it further than just do some games around it, it just resonated, and my coach said, I didn't speak to you for 2 weeks, and then all of a sudden you were coming back with plans and saying this is how we're going to implement it, and all that kind of thing. So, but yeah, I just wanted to jump in and say, as soon as I understood about it, I loved it. So
good.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, yep.
Sorry, just one last point. You talked about the games. I think it's quite important for coaches to understand that it takes time and patience and effort to become familiar with the principles. So we see our job as to devise these principles. They're dynamic, they're constantly changing and updating. So they're not, here's the box, here's the boundary, here's the toolbox, you just delve in there. They're constantly being updated, and you can become more skillful as a coach in implementing these ideas. It's not a case of just dipping in, using it and put it back. There are lots of different ways, and actually you can contribute to understanding and knowledge by using the methods in innovative ways and providing evidence that helps to take the field forward. So it is it's a skill. It's not something that's constraints. It works magically. It's like a magic bullet. You just sort of tweak a task, learning occurs. It happens. Not at all. You can still waste time, provide poor experiences for the learner, unless you updated your understanding in the way that you use the skills in practice. I'll stop there.
I do have a couple. Well, one other main question that I'm starting to refine the way I ask it, because sometimes I kind of blather on with it. But are there any other areas of academia, books, papers, that sort of thing that you could that would complement what you're doing, David, with this PhD? When that paper comes out as well, I'll be onto it for sure. I am listening to the Constraints Collective as well. I've been promoting that on the Discord as well. So,
that's fantastic.
But I'd be any other areas of academia / books, papers that you could recommend. Maybe not off the cuff, but if in the future, Michael Maloney, who was the PhD student with Ian Renshaw, he actually got in touch with me a couple of nights ago. So I'd already read your paper, but he got in touch with me the other night and said, hey, you might be interested in this. And I was like, well, funnily enough, I've got a chat with them both on Friday. But is there anything of interest that you guys are looking into that's piqued your interest in the last couple of months?
Yeah, well, David's PhD student. He's we're really working him hard, so he's working on papers and presentations for the future. David, do you want to explain?
Yeah, we have a number of papers coming out, both the empirical one with the 1+1, and also how that relates to measures of flow. So those should be out hopefully later this year. We're also developing this piece that we recently published was a more meta-theoretical one. We're going to publish one also kind of from just starting from the ecological dynamics perspective. So as far as the work coming from our PhD, but more broadly in terms of reading, I'm an avid reader, but I always struggle a little bit in terms of recommending things, not because there aren't good things to read, there's endless good things to read, but I guess the way that I think about it is that it's very much situated within somebody's process of curiosity. So what is really interesting to somebody, I think, if you think about whatever is kind of pulling you in the most and you learn about that, it kind of naturally tends to branch out and grow. And that's kind of how I've come to do this PhD with Keith, was just kind of gradually, bit by bit, I'd like to know a bit about that, diving into it a little bit, and then it kind of, you go into that rabbit hole and it leads you somewhere else, and then you kind of start to get this kind of a branching network of ideas. So I think that's a difficult thing to say without knowing the context of somebody's interests and goals, what kind of to direct them to. Well, if that makes sense.
I would just say then, me as a coach, as a martial arts coach, is there anything, doesn't have to be on right now. I have put you on the spot a little bit, but I have been asking this of everyone that I interview, and my book list has grown substantially. So I'm keen to read and learn more.
But my take on it is essentially to encourage listeners to take a look at ecological dynamics principles, particularly where they're explained in terms of application to sports. You can learn a lot from coaches in other sports who are using those principles of practice. And really, then the challenge is to contextualize those principles to your own sport. So if you are a martial arts coach, then how do you contextualize those principles and ideas, insights to the context of your own combat environment? So you can learn a lot from other coaches, is what I'm saying. Specifically from an MMA viewpoint, take a look at Tyler Yerby and Sean Mishka's publications on MMA, applying ecological dynamics principles, and they are, they're really into movement more generally, applied to American football, for example. Tyler now working with a US snowboarding organization, etc. So I think that for me shows how these principles can be applied to different contexts, and then it's just really down to, so I don't want the coach to be a passive receiver of information, to be an actively involved in it and engaged in understanding, okay, so what would that mean for me then in my context? I think that would be a good way to read these
I really like that. That's a gem. Thanks very much, Keith. Gentlemen, thank you so much for this chat. I had so much fun. I mean, I learned heaps. I'm looking forward to your paper coming out, David. Guys, you both have made me a very happy coach down this end. I think there's going to be a lot of people watching this and going to pull a lot of information from it. So yeah, I hope to. I'll keep in touch because I would like to know more about Tyler Yerby, was it, and Shaw.
Yeah, Tyler Yerby and Sean Mishka.
Mishka.
I can send you a copy of the paper that we co-authored together on MMA.
Was that with Scott Seavright from Primal MMA?
Maybe, yeah. I can't remember all the authors involved, but we've also written kind of a interesting piece on Bruce Lee as well.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's a couple of papers there that may be relevant for listeners to look into.
Fantastic. Well, excellent, gentlemen. Well, thank you very much. I'll, as I said, be in touch and really appreciate you taking the time today. Look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you for having us on.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Right.